Yeah,
Okay.
we have some more people trickling in, but that's
Yeah.
totally normal. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our March edition of our Analytics for a Better World Cafe. Very excited for you guys to all join. We have a really interesting talk today from FemData from the University of Amsterdam. With me today is Paulina and Myrthe, and I will not take too much time and hand it over to them. They're going to give a short talk, and then at the end we'll have some questions. If you want to also use the chat function throughout the talk to ask any questions, you're more than welcome to. And we are recording today's session so that it can be watched back at a later point. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you guys. Thank you.
Yes, hi everyone. I'll give some short introduction into who we are, both us as persons, but also as FemData. So I'll start with that actually. There we go. So thank you for the introduction, Kate. I'm Myrthe. I'm a third year PhD student in marketing. My focus is more on consumer psychology. And within that, I really focus on AI fairness and how to use tools to help consumers detect bias, detect discrimination, and protect themselves. And within that, of course, that also aligns with today's topic of whether data is objective and the different ways in that gender bias can enter the data pipeline. Specifically at the moment, I'm looking into explainable AI, if anyone knows anything about that. So that's kind of my topic space in my PhD. I'll give the floor to Paulina to introduce herself.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Paulina. I'm a third year PhD student in business analytics, and my PhD is more on the data science side. So I'm doing research on prediction models for time-dependent data. In the past years, I've worked on a range of different applications, mostly involving human data, such as, for instance, predictions within the medical field. And yeah, within my work, it's super important to me that the models that we use are transparent and that they're suitable for the application at hand. And that's why I'm also interested in the bias topic.
Yeah. Why did we start FemData and what are we doing? Well, first, I'll give you a little bit of motivation, let's say, in the background, is because big data or data in general, whether you have, AI applications, algorithms, anything that uses data, is often seen as something that would really help your company, your research is just in general like a really good thing to do. We put some headlines here, for example, Forbes, 5 benefits of big data analytics and how companies can get started, the advantages of data-driven decision-making by Harvard Business School, and Harvard Business Review, Big Data, the Management Revolution. And while we're really conscious of all of the great things that data can do, so this is by no means a pessimistic outlook that we have with FemData. We do want to make sure that people realize the different ways in that gender bias can creep in, and then how we can deal with that so we can really use data for good. And I think that's also why this is such a good opportunity for us to speak to you with Analytics for Good. So I think we align in that sense. And we also see that there are more feminist policies at the moment. I don't know how that will change with Wilders and the coming parliament, but for now we still have this. But that's all really nice and there's a really good space for us to work in. But in the digital space, we see that there are still a lot of issues that are now popping up and people are researching more, whether that is within the industry or within research. We put some headlines here again, one about deepfake porn that's ruining women's life. I think a few months ago, this also happened to Taylor Swift. So it got even more attention over the last months. But also, for example, in research in gender imbalance in medical imaging data sets, there's much more attention, luckily, on different ways that gender bias can affect us or how just in general, we need more feminist views for the use of data and data tools. So this is kind of the space that we're working in. So what do we do with this? We take an intersectional approach where we, of course, look at gender bias, but we also take other sort of biases into account. And we host monthly or even twice monthly talks and workshops on different topics from all different types of disciplines. So we invite speakers to talk about their research or their industry job, and from all different kinds of disciplines. So we had someone from philosophy, from psychology, from computer science. Let me think. We had someone from a more management perspective, from law. We have all kinds of different people. And we really try to find also different kinds of people, because we notice that oftentimes we're working in silos, and the work that I'm doing is probably also been done before, maybe in a different way by someone else, and we're working on it at the same time. Because we're so siloed in our research, we don't really talk. So this is what we kind of wanted to establish, more of exchange of best practices, of knowledge, discussions on how we can kind of use data for good without the gender bias aspect of it. And we also realize that academia, we're doing really cool work, but there's a lot of work also done in industry. And unfortunately, a lot of that we design in academia cannot be used by industry and the other way around. So we're also really pushing on connecting industry and academia together so we can learn from each other. And I also want to mention that we recently received the ASF grant from the business school to develop the initiative further. So we've been using that grant to further develop this into different avenues. I just want to plug some of our own things in here. We have quite some upcoming events. Also, I put this here to kind of show you the kind of events that we're doing. So Paulina and I have both been just searching for people that do work in this from all kinds of fields. Our most upcoming one is from an industry expert, Dr. Hinda Hannes. She's more from computer science. We have computer vision upcoming. We have an emergency doctor at the NHS who's also doing research in London. Then we have more consumer research. So we have all kinds of different topics, and we're hopefully, we're trying to highlight different aspects of how this can be used, which is kind of hopefully the outcome of these discussions that we're having during these talks. And then we're also invited for a talk at SPI 25 on the 12th of June, which is similar to this presentation today, but slightly different. So if you're still interested, if you got you a bit motivated, we would love to see you there too. But so we have the talks and we have more aspirations. That's all for future. This is what we got the grant for as well. So we're planning to do a symposium more with, let's say, activists also. So Amnesty, Bits for Freedom, also more industry players, some academia. So if you're interested in that, hearing more, you can follow us on LinkedIn. We're also looking to collaborate more with other NGOs and companies and build workshops, because while this is all really nice, I mean, I love the talks that we give, and they give us a lot of motivation just personally already. And hopefully the participants too. These are the people that are generally already interested in this topic, right? So we're also trying to think of how can we create more impact and reach the people that maybe not necessarily think about this themselves. And this would be one of our ways. So that's just a short introduction, quick introduction into FemData itself. Today, we would like to talk to you about, let's say, 3 areas of the data pipeline that we believe are really important to get right to avoid gender bias. So what we will do is Paulina will present data collection, and then bucket 2, data labeling and modeling. And I will present data interpretation. And we'll give you some examples in this bucket about, first of all, what we mean by these labels, but also we give some examples of what that means in practice. And we're using a health and a business application. So one for each in each of these stages. And these will all be different. So there are a lot of different examples that we'll present today. And the reason for that is that, unfortunately, because it's still such a, well, kind of new area, there's not one example that we could find that kind of is research in all of these different stages. So we had to kind of find a way to show you what we mean. So bear with us. We'll try to make it as clear as possible. And on the slide, you'll also see on the right upper corner, if you're lost, the kind of stage that we're in, but also the application that we're in. So for health, we have the cross, and then for business, we have the shopping bag. So that's just to help guide you through the presentation. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Paulina.
Yes, thank you. So we thought that would be sensible to be on the same page about some basic definitions first. So I will start with the point of how do we define bias in data science. So when we started looking into this, we noticed that there's slightly different opinions on this, and that what people include in this definition is very, very strongly influenced by the field that they're originally trained in. So I will briefly go into the statistical definition, and then we'll see how we can extend this by including a social science or an ethical perspective. So in statistical terms, when we talk about bias, then we have a true parameter in the population, and we're trying to approximate this parameter using some kind of model in the sample. So when we have bias, or when we want to assess bias, this is formalized as the difference between the expected value of a particular statistic and this true parameter. And how big this bias is influenced by a number of things. One of them being, for instance, that our sample is not an accurate representation of the population that we're actually interested in. So that would be our formal statistical definition. However, of course, when we work with data about humans, so for instance, in human resources or in political science or in psychology or medicine, this definition, which is, a very formal thing, needs to go a bit further because we're dealing with social systems now. So in the past, it's been argued that if we view algorithms as socio-technical systems, then that also means that we need to expand our view on what bias actually means. So then we would take this traditionally statistical definition and include concepts like justice, fairness, and discrimination into the picture, because it affects actual people. Yeah, next slide, please. And this is actually already how we get to our first stage. So first I will talk about bias in the actual data set. So bias that relates to who and how we sample. And what I will do here is three things. So I'm going to structure this a little bit. So first, I'll give some basic definitions. Secondly, I'll give an example of data bias that's related to skew in the data. And third, I will talk about a case study in FemTech that's been presented at FemData a few weeks ago, which outlines not skew in the data collection, but how collecting sensitive data about women can harm them in the long run because of the societal context. So this is indirectly related to who we put in our sample. Okay, so let's start with some basic definitions. So in the 1990s, Friedman and Nissenbaum were among the first to provide a classification of biases in computer systems in general. And what they did was that they distinguished different types of biases, and I will go into two of these biases in particular. So first of all, I'll talk a bit about pre-existing bias, and secondly, I'll talk about technical bias. So first of all, we have the pre-existing bias, which means that the computer system incorporates a bias that already exists independently of the computer system. So this bias would have its roots in, for instance, social institutions and practices and in general attitudes that we have in society. So this can be on an individual level, but also on a more systematic societal level. So for instance, if we have sexism in society, then this would mean that women would be less likely to be considered in data applications, such as, for instance, in medicine or in engineering. So for instance, if you look at educational software, if this is designed mainly with young boys in mind, then this is not going to generalize very well to other groups. Or for instance, we also see this in car design a lot. And secondly, next to the pre-existing bias, we will have the technical bias. So technical bias is a little bit different. This has more to do with deficiencies in the technical tools that you use. So for instance, just as a brief example that's just a bit out there, imagine that you have a recording tool that has trouble picking up on higher frequencies in voices. So in this particular case, it simply would pick up on fewer female voice characteristics because on average, we have higher pitched voices, and that would skew the data set. Yeah, next slide, please. And two big examples of skewed data sets can often be found in image recognition, firstly, and secondly, also in a lot of medical studies. So let's start with image analytics. So a lot of research has been done on this, and it's been shown that a lot of the commonly used data sets for benchmark tests are mostly composed of males, first of all, and of white people. And therefore, researchers have shown that a lot of classifications work better for white males than for females or for people who are not white. So for instance, there's been a study a few years ago in 2018 where they've shown that the classifications were worst for females with darker skin, which is quite problematic because those are also people who are commonly marginalized in society anyway. So depending on the application, this can end quite badly. Another example for this, for instance, would be situation recognition. So situation recognition is the problem of producing a concise summary of the situation that is depicted in an image. So what previous research also from a few years ago has shown that, for instance, if women are represented as cooking twice as often as men, a model will very, very likely pick up on this correlation when producing the output. However, even if you balance this out, correlations can still be picked up indirectly. So researchers have suggested that, for instance, if children are unlabeled and they co-occur with the cooking, and then there's more children in pictures with women than there's children in pictures with men, then the model is going to pick up on the association cooking and women via the children again. So you need to pay a bit more attention to those indirect correlations as well, instead of just balancing the data set, because that's not enough. Okay, so going from image analytics to another example from the medical field, researchers have often pointed out a big problem in health research, which is that women, but also minorities, are often not included to a sufficient extent in clinical trials or medical studies in general. So for instance, there's been a study from a few researchers from the Mayo Clinic in the United States a few years ago who showed that for the studies that they've assessed, women were less likely to be enrolled in cancer treatment trials than men, even though they had a higher prevalence of some cancers than men, but that was not taken into account in the enrollment procedure. So then you would tailor a treatment to a group that would not extend to the females and to, for instance, minorities. Yeah. Yeah, so let's stick with the health example for now, because now we're going to move on to a case study that, as I said, has been presented a few weeks ago. Yes, thank you. So as I said, the data collection bias doesn't, for me personally, it doesn't just mean that we need to pay attention to skews in the data set, but we also need to pay attention to, as I said, the societal context that is associated with particular marginalized groups. And I think we see this very nicely when we collect data on fertility of women, such as in this example, which was about socioethical risks in fertility and menstruation tracking apps. Yeah, so in the past years, we have seen an explosion in available femtech apps. So we see a lot of these fertility and menstruation tracking apps, such as, for instance, Flow. And while these are originally meant to be a tool for empowerment and bodily autonomy, their implementations actually do come with a number of risks. And because women are the ones most commonly tracking their period and fertility, this can lead to a cycle of increasing inequality. And I'll briefly go into a few points to illustrate what I mean by this. So as I said, we've had a talk about this by two PhD researchers from KU Leuven. So if you're interested in the research, let me know, because then I can send you the paper. Yeah, so let's go into some of the socioethical considerations. So first of all, there's the issue of stereotyping. When we look at these apps, then we often see that it caters to a very, very specific audience, namely that you're young, that you're menstruating, that you're heterosexual, and that you're able-bodied. And by introducing these applications into the medical world, we run the risk that these apps actually amplify particular stereotypes that we already have in society about what it means to be a woman, and because we're exposing people to these preconceived categories. And what is presented on these apps simply is not a diverse representation. So that's problematic in itself. Then secondly, we have a problem with commodification. So it turns out that this very, very detailed information on our bodily states and on our menstruation is actually pretty much sought after by companies. So they're willing to pay a lot of money for it. So technically they can use it to predict consumer behavior. And when you supply this data to the apps, then you're the product and the consumer at the same time, probably without knowing. Because if we're being honest, most people don't read all the statements that you have to sign off when you use these apps. That's just, yeah, let's just be realistic about this. And the third point, which I think is a really, really important one, is that we have a surveillance issue. So some apps provide the option that you can share some of this data with a second party, such as, for instance, a partner. And in the worst situation, we could imagine that this can lead to a situation where problems, for instance, that women are more commonly associated with than men, such as partner violence that is experienced, could become amplified. And especially after we've seen the overturning of Roe versus Wade, there's also the risk that women could be surveilled for having had an abortion by law enforcement, because technically you could collaborate with the app providers. So let's imagine that, for instance, in the app, you could see that somebody's missing their period, and then via location tracking, you can see where they've traveled. So via linking these pieces of information, technically you could find out whether somebody's at a high probability of having had an abortion. Yeah, so here we see that via some bodily processes that are associated with being female, such as menstruating, you're actually put at a higher social risk via this technology where data about your bodily states is collected, which, as I said in the beginning, was actually originally meant to help us. But yeah, but because women are in a difficult position in society, when we collect this data, this can actually make things worse if it's used in a bad way. Yeah, so all in all, I think there's a lot of considerations when it comes to the data collection process, and we need to start seeing this a little bit in the social context in which the data arises, and yeah, the consequences that come from collecting particular parts of data. Yeah, next, please. So that was a brief introduction to the data collection bias from two different perspectives. And now let's briefly move on to data labeling and data modeling. So now we've collected our data, and now we're starting to analyze it. So first things first, what do I mean by, sorry?
We have some questions or some comments about the data collection part. So Brian asks, is collection also impacted by speed of speech? I think he was referring when in terms of the interview process or I think
the measuring of high pitch, I think. Like if you have a measurement of higher pitched, if it's not capturing higher pitch, then you lose out on that. So then if the collection is also impacted by speed of speech, I mean, I guess it could be, right? If it's not attuned to that. So I think it could be, but I'm looking at Paulina. I don't think that it was one of the things that they measured specifically. But
no, it was also, so the paper that I was referring to, this was like a conceptual categorization. So the example that I brought up with the higher pitched voices, that was also not in the paper. That was just an example from me to illustrate what can be meant by this categorization. So it's not an experimental study that they ran in this paper. Yeah.
Okay. And then just Sarah says that now football coaches track female footballers' cycle to understand performance high and lows, and that she thought that it was an interesting application of data. So she wanted to.
For sure, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Then I think we can keep going for now.
Thanks for the question and for the comment. I really, really like how engaged people are. But yeah, indeed, let's move on. Okay. So what do we mean by label bias? So when I talk about label bias, what I mean is that the available labels for a particular subpopulation are systematically incorrect. So for instance, positive examples from the disadvantaged group could be mislabeled as negative, and negative examples from the advantaged group can be mislabeled as positive systematically, so on average. And very roughly speaking, there's two different ways of labeling the data. So first of all, you can let a human do it. So for instance, I give a human a set of pictures and they say, oh, this is a dog, this is a cat, this is a cucumber. Or secondly, I could also let a model do it. The problem is that in both cases, I think there's potential for a bias to re-enter the data pipeline. So for instance, with human labeling, this is the one I'm going to focus on a bit more. The bias that a person has can influence the way that they label a picture. So previous research has shown that, for instance, a human annotator is more likely to label a female face as happy than a male face because of pre-existing biases that we have in society, compared to when you do it more neutral based on preset scoring rules. Yeah, so, and then the problem arises if we try to mitigate this issue via, for instance, model-powered labeling. We have a problem if there's bias in the model that this enters the data set again, and we're not even noticing it. So yeah, so both options are not really clean, they're not really perfect, but there's a lot of people who are currently doing work on that. Yeah, and the second thing, which I personally think is very important to mention, is that gender bias in the labeling context also has a very strong qualitative aspect. So oftentimes these labels are restricted to male versus female, so we have like a binary thing going on. However, what we see now is that a lot of people actually don't conform to that binary coding, so they might not see themselves as strictly male or female. And if we don't allow for particular labels, then these people are systematically being excluded from the data set. And they're also at risk of being flagged in a system for being ambiguous, for instance, which could potentially put people, for instance, from the queer community at danger if it's used in particular applications. So this is something that is not really on the data science side, but that should require more input from a sociological perspective and from an ethical perspective. Yeah, next one, please. So now I will move on from data labeling to data modeling. So what I have here is, again, a health example and a commercial example, and I'll briefly go into both of them. So now we've labeled our data, we're done with that, so we've collected it, we've labeled it, now we're trying to model it to get some conclusions out of the data. So as I said, for the first example, we go back to medicine. A few years ago, researchers from UCL published a paper in which they reanalyzed some data on liver disease prediction. So a lot of these models actually originally had a very good accuracy, but when they started stratifying it based on sex, they saw that women suddenly arrived at higher false negative rates than men. And the reason why this is a problem is because false negatives mean that you have the condition, so you would have liver disease, but the model says that you don't. So especially in medicine, false negatives are a really big problem. You're trying to minimize that. Yeah, so ultimately women would be more likely to have a negative treatment outcome because they're simply not flagged for having the condition. And this is pretty much in line with other research that's been done, which shows that the biochemical thresholds that need to be applied differ between males and females. So the biochemical thresholds they use in testing in medicine. And that has not been done for a very, very long time. And for the second example, let's move on to marketing again. So a few years ago, researchers it was not an experiment, but it was like a field study. So they didn't randomize this, but it was a field study where they showed that an ad that was intended to promote jobs as well as training in STEM fields was shown to 20% more men than women. And what they did was that they tested 3 explanations. So the first explanation was that they thought maybe women are less likely to click on the ad. They found out that this was not the case. The second explanation was that they thought, maybe fewer women were on the social media platform. They also ruled that one out. And then the third explanation was that country-specific differences in how women are treated, so differences in sexism between countries could be the explanation. Also ruled that one out, which is how they arrived at the fourth explanation, which was that this could be an artifact of algorithms being constructed such that they place the ads in the most cost-efficient manner, and that it's more costly to show it to women. So yeah, this is the one that they ended up with. So in a nutshell, the message of that paper was, okay, even if an ad is intended to get more women into STEM, or even if an ad is actually designed to be shown to an equal number of men and women, the design of the algorithm that promotes the ads can actually still make the idea backfire if there's an indirect mechanism that is somehow gender or sex related. So you need to pay a bit more attention to what you optimize it for. Okay, so in conclusion for this part of the talk, these were a couple of examples of how bias can enter the first 2 stages, namely data collection, and secondly, data labeling, data modeling. And now Myrthe will talk about the influence on data interpretation.
Yes. So what I will do is, because my knowledge is a bit more in consumer psychology, I will give you some examples from there, and I'll also talk a little bit more about the worries that I'm having or we're having about this. So data is often seen as objective, even though more and more people now know that is not always the case. There's a recent paper that was actually published in Nature that I posted here, objective and bias-free measures of candidate motivation during job applications. And what they did was they made a computer vision, so recognition of facial expressions of the candidates and their stance, their posture, let's say, during these video applications, and then derive their candidate motivation from that. I think hopefully for a lot of you, there are kind of a couple of bells ringing when I say such things. So there's still this kind of notion that data can be objective. I see there are a couple of questions. If it's okay, I'm going to take these after this part because I think these are actually really good discussion points. So I'm just, sorry, Brian, I'm going to pause it for just a second. Yeah, and the reason why I'm bringing this up again, that data can be seen or is seen as objective, is because when we think of tools to help consumers or make people more aware, there's a really high AI literacy, both from the people that are on the receiving end, so the consumers, but also people that are using it that are not developers, such as, I will talk a little bit more about that later, but in health applications where you're physicians and you're using an AI tool to help you kind of make a diagnosis or look at a radiology photo. So what I mean with high AI illiteracy is that a lot of people don't understand computational rules and don't have a high analytical ability. So even if you would explain to them how an algorithm or a data tool or data in general, all of these steps are used, it's really hard for a lot of people to really grasp the amount or the extent that that can hurt or discriminate them, taking a slightly pessimistic view here. So I'll give you two examples. The first one is in health. So because people believe that an AI is probably better, there is a lot of algorithmic over-reliance. There's one paper by Jacobs et al. That showed that physicians often over-rely on machine learning recommendations when it comes to treatment selection for depression and specifically antidepressants, and also the strength of the antidepressant. So they often just listen to the recommendation of the AI tool, but kind of forgot that they have also a lot of knowledge themselves, right? And there's more experience and they see the patient in front of them. Not to say that oftentimes these tools are not more accurate than physicians, but or in any actual application, to be fair. But there are other things to consider, right? Something can maybe be super helpful in treating the depression, but maybe it's not super helpful because they are also going through X, Y, and Z. So what they found was actually overall, maybe for some people it was more accurate and more helpful. Overall, the welfare of the patients went down. And we all can see it in more extreme versions. I put a picture here from another Nature paper by Adamson and Smith, and I show how when you use image recognition, again, if you don't have any diversity in your data sets that you're training on, the outcome, the interpretation of that data set will also be quite harmful. In this case, if you have not noticed, there are not a lot of, or any, basically, photos of dark-skinned people with moles in this data set. So if you are using an AI tool to recognize whether a mole is malignant or not, and you have a dark skin, this model will probably not be super accurate. But when we have this over-reliance on tools, on these models, doctors can use this without thinking twice, like, oh, maybe this model for a specific application area is not so accurate. It's probably very accurate when it comes to more lighter skinned people. So we really have to be aware of the application area and all of these other steps that Paulina just highlighted, like what happened in those steps and how can we interpret it now? But because we have this high AI literacy, we can see some issues with that interpretation of that. And then when we look at this is more the health side, physician side. When we look at the consumer side, we also see that consumers seem a little bit lost with what this means. There's a recent paper by Alexandra Dewani and her colleagues, and they looked into algorithmic pricing. And algorithmic pricing is basically pricing a product or a service by the use of an algorithm and a lot of sensitive consumer data. And what they looked at specifically is demographic pricing. So they looked at different demographics, such as your age, your gender, but also your skin color, your religion, your social status. All of these things can be demographics. And it looked at whether people were more accepting of the price, let's say, of, I don't know, this glass being priced by an algorithm or by a human. I do have some concerns about their specific stimuli, let's say their experimental paradigm, because what they did was they had a human in a store say, well, you have to pay €5 for the glass because you are a woman, versus an algorithm where you don't have that transparency and it's not that in your face. So there are a couple of things that, I mean, you have to think about for this research, but in general, people see an algorithm because it's more objective, less judgmental, less exploitative, as more fair when they do that versus when a human would do that. And I think that's very interesting and maybe also worrisome, because in the end, the outcome is the same, right? This glass is more because you're a woman, just as an example. And then the other area that we're really worried about and that we're also having two different talks about is bias propagation. So being confronted with this bias output, for example, in search engines, if you see biased outputs because you're looking for a profession and you see, like, you're looking for a cook and you only see men, and you're looking for maintenance and then you only see guys, just consuming this content, this biased content by the algorithm, can repropagate your own implicit gender bias. David Amodia gave a talk about this. It was our very first talk. We were very excited. He is a social psychologist at the University of Amsterdam, and this is what he found. So the bias of the people, the consumers, after seeing this biased content was even bigger, even though they didn't realize this. So this is not an active process that a lot of people are aware of. And this is something in a slightly different way, what Shelley Rathi and her colleagues also found. We will have an upcoming talk about her pretty soon. What she showed was, first, the outcome or the content of search algorithms are gender biased. And then the second of all, she did a more behavior measure with the acceptance of consumers. So consumers don't really seem to care. They will still click the ad, they will still buy the product, they will still consume the content. And in this case, the consumers were aware of how skewed it was. So all in all, pretty problematic, because if we don't take any account of the application area in which we're using the tool, but also if we don't, if we're not aware or cautious of all of the other steps previously that Paulina outlined in which data or gender bias can enter the data, and we really think like, oh, data is objective, is all good and well, we can have pretty dire, in some cases, outcomes. I just put this as kind of a slight joke at the end. AI, of course, is now everywhere, and I saw this ad recently and I just thought it was very funny, about a genius AI toothbrush, which apparently just means that it can feel the pressure of which you like press on your teeth. That's the AI part. But AI is now presented everywhere, the same with data. And while this is more of a funny, and I think a lot of people understand that this is not very, intense or maybe super biased towards your specific teeth or whatever, you do see it everywhere, and it's growing and growing and being more popular. So how to solve this? This is a very difficult question and one that we cannot answer. I just want to give a small overview and kind of a, let's say, quick summary of the things that we talked about. So there are some database techniques that are being developed. There are, for example, fairness metrics that can be programmed into the algorithm, but there are also, we can have a whole discussion on this, I think, another time, where what these fairness metrics say and whether it's fair or not and which ones you should use. But I think the main points that we want to communicate with FemData and also hopefully during this talk is that there's very little interdisciplinary work and exchange between the fields. You've seen it because we could not use one example to go through the whole data pipeline, but also we have to like take it from everywhere. And then the other one is that the standard model assessment of if a data is biased or not, or a tool is biased or not, is still really focused on accuracy, sensitivity, and we really need to start incorporating these other factors. So the societal impact, the ethics, the fairness, which is also something that Paulina talked about a bit earlier. So we would love to discuss. I mean, I will look at the questions and maybe we can answer those or discuss those first. But we would also love, from our point of view, to discuss on what you think, how we could solve this, or if you have any tips for other people, or maybe a really good research question that someone should work on, just to get some, some more positive spirit going than just this negative output that we've showed you so far.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Myrthe and Paulina. I think we do have some people who have already been chatting, so maybe we can bring the discussion to life as well. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions to start us off?
I see one from Brian. He said, not sure where this fits in the discussion, but if I look at the participants, it's highly skewed to females. Yeah, this is one of the issues. I think that's a very good point. Talk to the men around you. I guess that's the main point. It's I think that's something that we also run into. Luckily, I think I have to look at Paulina. We've had quite some good, I think, representation during our talks, but it's more rare for us to walk into someone who is who identifies as male and then really cares about this topic. That's, I think, maybe more of a statement or an observation rather than a point of discussion. But maybe we could discuss how you could actually motivate more guys to care about this. Maybe, Brian, do you have any idea about that? Not to put you on the spot, maybe someone else also has an idea about that.
If I can say something about this, because I feel that like a lot of sexism is an issue that lies with men. It is men not taking into account women. It's not women not doing something good enough to like be to be taken serious or to be taken even into consideration. So it feels a bit weird to constantly have to remind men that they also have to take you into account. But I think it is what we have to do, I guess. But I think focusing on like that people high up in the hierarchy actually take it serious so that it kind of trickles down would work best.
Kind of lead by example and then find some advocates that can show that. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. What else?
I have a question. Oh, sorry, please, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've been adding some things to chat. So I work in STEM actually, so in aviation and sustainable aviation fuel. So it is, and then I also work in sport and football. So I went into these industries as a new person actually, and obviously it was very clear there was not like a skew towards men and male, it was male. And so everything you're talking about with regards to targeting. Basically, everything is skewed towards not balance. And so, like Brian's saying, there's mostly women on this call because obviously we are the ones that are probably affected by the bias. But unfortunately, at the moment, quite a lot of the people in decision-making positions are guys. So I'm in a group called Women in Football. And I'm selected to be an entrepreneur in that group. And yeah, they say that they're 80% women, female, 20% men, but they definitely want to grow male allyship because it, of course, you know, a lot of the time they are making decisions. So if you put it in from the top and from the roles and you make sure everything is checked and it's not biased, then obviously that makes probably a bigger impact because actually maybe you know these statistics about there's more CEOs called John than female CEOs, you know, things.
Yeah.
So we're kind of pretty aware, being females on the group, that this just is the way it is. But obviously we are all contributing to the rebalance and it's reprogramming because it's even reprogramming our own subconscious. But, you know, I always used to say he with regards to a scientist or, you know, things like this. So we've also had to go through our own reprogramming. But then obviously groups are forming that are sort of working on this. And it's, of course, it is about male allyship. So it's how do you obviously not just make it I mean, there's obviously different approaches and it's definitely to be discussed and put into the work. So it is like board members, do you have a gender balance? Do you have in aviation, there's a target of 25% women in STEM and aviation. So it's really low right now. So it just takes a lot of, but now I started doing our work. I've seen there was 0 female CEOs in Europe, airline CEOs. Now in 22, I think it was, there was like a whole row of 10 female CEOs and things like this. So it is kind of incrementally putting that work in and then showing the bias with data because it's all there. So yeah, if Brian wants to also comment.
Well, sorry for being so muted and on video, but I would say.
I know. We lost you, Brian. Anyway, so yeah, I can carry on talking about things, but more comments than questions. It's really interesting. So how long did it take you to, what is your process for the work?
You mean for FemData? What we're doing specifically, or?
Yeah, how will you evolve your work? Will you get funding? Will you work with clients?
Yeah, so far we've got funding by ASF. It's a Sustainable Future grant that is specifically for the symposium that we want to organize and just also paying our speakers at some point. That would be lovely because obviously we don't want to kind of continue that cycle of people doing all of these things for free. So the funding is meant for that, so we cannot use that for any other ventures. But on a side, what we're looking into is more, yeah, exactly. I know kind of Brian's comment and what we've been talking about now, how to reach those people that don't care and that are often, unfortunately, men. How can we have these discussions, and maybe not even discussions, but you know, how can we influence processes for the people that actually do the work, right? The programmers or the people in power. How do we reach them? That is, I think, more a philosophical question plus something that, you know, practically we're thinking about how to work together with NGOs, maybe more like activism, more like workshops. So really go to the company and get ourselves into the company. But of course, that is hard because you need someone to want you in the company. So we're talking to all kinds of different people on what their experience is, people that are already working in the field. What can we learn from them? But I mean, if you have any tips, we are very open to hearing more ideas. I mean, why
I've
would
actually
it be
got some
pressure?
ideas. I've definitely got ideas because I'm in now quite a few women in business groups. Obviously, having the data or coming. So I actually we created a webinar last year around data and travel and football, and it was for the men's football. But actually, we thought we should do it for the women's football and then do a comparison. Anyway, I'm happy to we can, if you're happy to share emails and things like that, we can
Of course,
talk
yeah, that'd be
afterwards and
fantastic.
things. But there's loads of topics. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering, so I think I was thinking that a lot of times I think men, at least men in tech and STEM, they know about these issues, but to work on these issues or acknowledge them takes more effort, takes more time, takes money because time equals money. And I was thinking like we have to find a way to address that, right? To have people generate time or give them time to address this. And I think that like a sustainable future grant might help, right? So you can have some money to spend on addressing these issues. But I think that's a big thing because I've actually experienced it myself. I was doing a neuroscience PhD, and there was this effect that a colleague of mine had found, and I was meant to replicate it and then investigate where the effect came from, right? And I was unable to replicate the effect, and I was really puzzled, like, how am I not able to replicate this effect? And it turns out that my colleague had only used males in his research, and I had actually used males and females. But then because I had so little time left on my PhD, I had to stick with the males because it was faster to just finish up the research with only the male group. So I've experienced myself how, you can be pressured for time, and just even though you care, you still might not make it there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, find different incentives within a company, right? Or within whether it's the university or whatever it is where you're working or doing your work, to get recognized for making the effort to make it less biased, whether that is gender or race or sexual orientation or whatever kind of bias you're having, of course. Brian, I see that you put your hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm in and out so much. I'm at a Marriott hotel and had to change floors in Hawaii.
Oh,
So it's the time difference is quite a bit. Anyway, I apologize.
no problem.
My pink shirt was not intentional. It just happened by accident. I have a pink shirt on, which was intentional to get a pink shirt a year and a half ago for a Boy Scout. I put in quotes, Boy Scout Camp Reed, recognizing the Boy Scouts is now fully both genders, right? Fully incorporated adults and youth, boys and girls. So I worked for Chevron for a number of years. One of the things you might want to look at, I don't know if you've looked at this data set, but a lot of these corporations put out videos about what's going on in their company or whatever. And is there a gender bias in their videos that they publish on the internet? I don't know if anyone's looked at that. I'll suggest from a Chevron perspective, you probably see a pretty equal number of females and males. The other thing is in California, where I live, I think there's a rule or law regarding the percentage of board members that have to be female.
Mm.
So I think you're looking at a lot of this stuff from a European perspective, as opposed from a US perspective. So those are a couple of things to think about, and ask, okay, are maybe some of the policies that are in the United States need to be applied to the European community?
Good point. I think most of the research that we presented was with US data, at least the one that I presented. I cannot speak for the one that Paulina presented, but because a lot of the consumer research is still very America-centered in the sense that you need American data sets to publish. So I know that they use like Prolific a lot, or like university labs in the US. But when it comes to policies, I actually don't know the difference. That would be a good one to look into. Yeah. Like these incentives that are there, right? For like the gender balance in in board members, for example. I don't know. I know we have some kind of laws that are upcoming, or like at least discussions about I forgot the word for it, but that you need to have a certain percentage in your company, for example. But I don't know the status of US versus
Yeah.
the EU, or the effect of that, right? Like, does it really help to have more female members in the board, and how does it trickle down to all of the other processes?
Well, Chevron's been very big on this for a long time. And some years ago, and I'm talking about it more than a decade, they found that when you have females in a meeting, the discussion is much more, a little bit more open. I'm going to say more open, because sometimes you get, and I'll suggest it happens on both sides, but if you have all males or all females, the dialogue is different. And so we really did encourage, cross-gender meetings and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Kate, I see that you have your hand.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. So I don't know if you saw in the news, but recently the generative AI that creates the pictures from Google was trained. They trained their AI to exclusively have diversity. So like they're trying to basically combat, like overcompensate a little bit. But this came to a situation where for instance, someone was searching for Confederate soldiers, pictures of Confederate soldiers, and it would only return people of color, which was a little bit controversial because obviously that's not historically accurate for one thing, and also very like concerning for others based on the content. So I wanted to ask you guys, clearly, like ensuring diversity is a difficult balancing act, because you obviously on one hand want to promote that there is diversity within these new data fields and new technologies, but how do you balance also being still like historically accurate, or how would you handle this challenge, or what are your thoughts on like this kind of situation that they have?
Yeah, that's actually a very, very good question. I personally don't have a clear answer to that, because I think this is also research that's only just now popping up. And I think the field just has to explore different options. Like I definitely see your point, but I don't have a way to solve this, because of course I also see what you mean, especially in the historical context. I don't know if Myrthe has any thoughts on this, or anybody else in the
had
group.
a discussion about this last week in CU Boulder, and there's one PhD who is now doing research on this. I believe, I don't know the exact question, but what he was telling me was that he was indeed looking at these like overcorrection almost of bias, where you want to make it so, like you want to have the representation exactly the same, or like, so 20% this, 20% this, 20%, instead of like the real situation in that specific country, or in this case, accuracy in history, of course. And he was interested in knowing that this is more consumer research again, into how people perceive that. So he is not researching how to fix it per se, but just how people, perceive that kind of output again. So that should be a really interesting paper once it's out. And I mean, knowing science, that will take a couple of years, unfortunately. But when it comes to more like a specific answer to your question of what to do about it, I really have no idea. I think this is when you talk about generative AI, whether that is like also, for example, I think it was called Bard. No, that's Google Bard. There was another name for it. There was a launch of this self-learning AI that then was quickly thought to have like neo-Nazi ideas and tweeting things that are against women and Jews. That was quickly taken off of the internet. I think I'm not a programmer, so I really don't know how that works, but I can only imagine that that is very difficult to account for. or to really build in all of these safeguards that, you know, this cannot happen, but it can also not overrepresent, and this we need to do, this we need to do. But I think the most important thing is to create discussions on what do we actually want in that regard. And that's not something that one person can answer, but also not a very satisfying answer to your question, I think.
That's okay.
Um,
Looking at the time, I think we have time for one last question. I think, Britt, you had a question? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to build on your question, because I was just thinking, like, do we think we can even like solve gender issues with AI, since like sexism and other types of discrimination are so built into our society still, that all our data in one way or the other represents this in very subtle, nuanced ways. And like AI is really cool because it can reproduce certain patterns that can still be new, but it will always in some way detect these patterns of oppression, so to speak. So like, do you think they could be like, I think my question is just, is AI part of the solution, right? Because it will clearly reproduce the problem. And there are so many little nuances that it's just really difficult to take it out, especially if most of the programmers are just white guys.
I think to answer that, I don't have an answer to that specifically, but next week, this is not to plug, but just generally because I think it's an interesting, maybe she will answer your question. We have Hinda Hanet, and she will present on actually how to not use data or algorithms or AI for certain things, and how it's sometimes more harmful than good. She built like an index for this. I don't know obviously what she's going to talk about in specific, because for me it's also an interesting talk to hear for the first time, but this is kind of her stance. Like, AI is not always good. It can be good, and there are multiple array of applications that, you know, we can use it to solve societal issues, but just not all the time. So maybe she will be an interesting person also to talk to about that. To hear her ideas, because mine are not super well informed on this issue yet.
I definitely agree with Britt on this statement, because as Britt already said, like, technology has a tendency to reproduce things that we already see in society. So I'm definitely not somebody who thinks that we can use data science and AI to solve every problem that we have in society. Absolutely not. But that's also one of the reasons why for FemData, we really try to invite speakers also from social sciences and from law and from ethics, for instance, because, for instance, there's a few applications within psychometrics that have also been discussed as, okay, should we even be doing this kind of research, because there's so much, for instance, racial bias in there and so much historical context to it. So I personally think just because a lot of things can be done, it doesn't mean that everything should be done, if you know what I mean. So you need to consider, the ethical implications of particular kinds of research. But
awesome. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I think we'll leave it there for today. Myrthe and Paulina from FemData, thank you so much for taking time to speak with everyone. I think you sparked a lot of questions. We'll share the recording afterwards, and I think people can have your website that they can get in touch with you. So FemData's website is available also via LinkedIn. And thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us and for all the interesting questions and discussions.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Really
Bye-bye.
interesting.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.